Chapter 17 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 17. Miscellaneous Phenomena. In a former chapter, I alluded to the form seen floating over graves by Billing, Phaethos amanuensis. By some persons, this luminous form is seen only as a light, just as occurs in many of the apparition cases I have related. How far Baron Reichenbach is correct in his conclusion that these figures are merely the result of the chemical process going on below, it's impossible for anyone at present to say. The fact that these lights do not always hover over the graves, but sometimes move from them, militates against this opinion, as I have before observed, and the insubstantial nature of the form which reconstructed itself after Phaethon had passed his stick through it proves nothing, since the same thing is asserted of all apparitions I meet with, let them be seen where they may, except in such very extraordinary cases as that of the Bride of Corinth, supposing that story to be true. At the same time, although these cases are not made out to be chemical phenomena, neither are we entitled to class them under the head of what is commonly understood by the word ghost, whereby we comprehend a shadowy shape informed by an intelligent spirit. But there are some cases, a few of which I'll mention, that it seems extremely difficult to include under one category or the other. The late Lieutenant General Robertson of Lowers, who served during the whole of the American War, brought home with him at its termination a Negro, who went by the name of Black Tom, and who continued in his service. The room appropriated to the use of this man, in the General's town residence, I speak of Edinburgh, was on the ground floor, and he was heard frequently to complain that he could not rest in it, for that every night the figure of a headless lady, with a child in her arms, rose out of the hearth and frightened him dreadfully. Of course nobody believed this story, and it was supposed to be the dream of intoxication, as Tom was not remarkable for sobriety. But, strange to say, when the old mansion was pulled down to build Gillespie Hospital, which stands on its site, there was found, under the hearthstone in that apartment, a box containing the body of a female from which the head had been severed, and beside her lay the remains of an infant, wrapped in a pillow-case trimmed with lace. She appeared, poor lady, to have been cut off in the blossom of her sins, for she was dressed, and her scissors were yet hanging by a ribbon to her side, and her thimble was also in the box, having apparently fallen from the shriveled finger. Now, whether we are to consider this a ghost, or a phenomenon of the same nature as that seen by Billing, it is difficult to decide. Somewhat similar is the following case, which I have borrowed from a little work entitled Supernaturalism in New England. Not only does this little extract prove that the same phenomena, be they interpreted as they may, exist in all parts of the world, but I think it will be granted me that, although we have not here the confirmation that time furnished in the former instance, yet it is difficult to suppose that this unexcitable person should have been the subject of so extraordinary a spectral illusion. Whoever has seen Great Pond, in the east parish of Haverhill, has seen one of the very loveliest of the 1,000 little lakes or ponds of New England. With its soft slopes of greenest verdure, its white and sparkly sand rim, its southern hem of pine and maple mirrored with spray and leaf in the glassy water, its graceful hill sentinels round about, white with the orchard bloom of spring, or tasseled with the corn of autumn, its long sweep of blue waters, broken here and there by picturesque headlands, it would seem a spot of all others where spirits of evil must shrink, rebuked and abashed, from the presence of the beautiful. Yet here, too, has the shadow of the supernatural fallen. A lady of my acquaintance, a staid and imaginative church member, states that, a few years ago, she was standing in the angle formed by two roads, one of which traverses the pond shore, the other leading over the hill which rises abruptly from the water. It was a warm summer evening, just at sunset. She was startled by the appearance of a horse and cart, of the kind used a century ago in New England, driving rapidly down the steep hillside and crossing the wall a few yards before her, without noise or displacing of a stone. The driver sat sternly erect, with a fierce countenance, grasping the reins tightly, and looking neither to the right nor to the left. Behind the cart, and apparently lashed to it, was a woman of gigantic size, her countenance convulsed with a blended expression of rage and agony, writhing and struggling like Laocoon in the folds of the serpent. Her head, neck, feet and arms were naked. Wild locks of grey hair streamed back from the temples, corrugated and darkened. The horrible cavalcade swept by across the street and disappeared at the margin of the pond. Many persons will have heard of the wild troop of Rodenstein, but few are aware of the curious amount of evidence there is in favor of the strange belief which prevails among the inhabitants of that region. The story goes that the former possessors of the castles of Rodenstein and Schnellert were robbers and pirates, who committed in conjunction all manner of enormities, and that to this day the troop, with their horses and carriages and dogs, are heard every now and then wildly rushing along the road between the two castles. It sounds like a fairy tale, yet so much was it believed that up to the middle of the last century regular reports were made to the authorities in the neighbourhood of the periods when the troop had passed. Since that, the Langerich, or court lead, has been removed to Firth, and they trouble themselves no longer about the Rodenstein troop. But a traveller named Wirth, who a few years ago undertook to examine into the affair, declares that the people assert that the passage of the visionary cavalcade still continues, and they assured him that certain houses that he saw lying in ruins were in that state because, as they lay directly in the way of the troop, they were uninhabitable. There is seldom anything seen, but the noise of carriage wheels, horses' feet, smacking of whips, blowing of horns, and the voice of these fierce hunters of men urging them on, are the sounds by which they recognize that the troop is passing from one castle to the other. And at a spot which was formerly a blacksmith, but now is a carpenter's, the invisible lord of Rodenstein still stops to have his horse shod. Mr. Wirth copied several of the depositions out of the court records, and they are brought down to June 1764. This is certainly a strange story, but it is not much more so than that of the black man, which I know to be true. During the 7 Years' War in Germany, a drover lost his life in a drunken squabble on the high road. For some time there was a sort of rude tombstone with a cross on it to mark the spot where his body was interred, but this has long fallen, and a milestone now fills its place. Nevertheless, it continues commonly asserted by the country people, and also by various travellers, that they have been deluded in that spot by seeing, as they imagine, herds of beasts, which on investigation prove to be merely visionary. Of course, many people look upon this as superstition, but a very singular confirmation of the story occurred in the year 1826, when 2 gentlemen and 2 ladies were passing the spot in a post-carriage. One of these was a clergyman, and none of them have ever heard of the phenomenon said to be attached to the place. They had been discussing the prospects of the minister, who was on his way to a vicarage, to which he had just been appointed, when they saw a large flock of sheep, which stretched quite across the road, and was accompanied by a shepherd and a long-haired black dog. As to meet cattle on that road was nothing uncommon, and indeed they had met several droves in the course of the day, no remark was made at the moment, till suddenly each looked at the other and said, "What is become of the sheep?" Quite perplexed at their sudden disappearance, they called to the postilion to stop, and all got out in order to mount a little elevation and look around, but still unable to discover them. They now bethought themselves of asking the postilion where they were, when, to their infinite surprise, they learned that he had not seen them. Upon this, they bade him quicken his pace, that they might overtake a carriage that had passed them shortly before, and inquire if that party had seen the sheep, but they had not. 4 years later, a postmaster named J. was on the same road, driving a carriage in which were a clergyman and his wife, when he saw a large flock of sheep near the same spot. Seeing they were very fine wethers, and supposing them to have been bought at a sheep fair that was then taking place a few miles off, J. drew up his reins and stopped his horse, turning at the same time to the clergyman to say that he wanted to inquire the price of the sheep, as he intended going next day to the fair himself. While the minister was asking him what sheep he meant, J. got down and found himself in the midst of the animals, the size and beauty of which astonished him. They passed him at an unusual rate, while he made his way through them to find the shepherd, when, on getting to the end of the flock, they suddenly disappeared. He then first learned that his fellow travellers had not seen them at all. Now, if such cases as this are not pure illusions, which I confess I find it difficult to believe, we must suppose that the animals and all the extraneous circumstances are produced by the magical will of the spirit, either acting on the constructive imagination of the seers, or else actually constructing the ethereal forms out of the elements at its command, just as we have supposed an apparition able to present himself with whatever dress or appliances he conceives. Or else, we must conclude these forms to have some relation to the mystery called palingenesia, which I have previously alluded to, although the motion and change of place render it difficult to bring them under this category. As for the animals, although the drover was lame, they were not, and therefore, even granting them to have souls, we cannot look upon them as the apparitions of the flock. Neither can we consider the numerous instances of armies seen in the air to be apparitions, and yet these phenomena are so well established that they have been accounted for by supposing them to be atmospherical reflections of armies elsewhere, in actual motion. But how are we to account for the visionary troops which are not seen in the air, but on the very ground on which the seers themselves stand, which was the case especially with those seen in Havre Park near Ripley in the year 1812? These soldiers wore a white uniform, and in the centre was a personage in a scarlet one. After performing several revolutions, the body began to march in perfect order to the summit of a hill, passing the spectators at a distance of about 100 yards. They amounted to several hundreds, and marched in a column, 4 deep, across about 30 acres. And no sooner were they passed, than another body, far more numerous, but dressed in dark clothes, arose and marched after them, without any apparent hostility. Both parties having reached the top of the hill, and there formed what the spectators called an L, they disappeared down the other side, and were seen no more. But at that moment a volume of smoke arose like the discharge of a park of artillery, which was so thick that the men could not, for 2 or 3 minutes, discover their own cattle. They then hurried home to relate what they had seen, and the impression made on them is described as so great that they could never allude to the subject without emotion. One of them was a farmer of the name of Jackson, aged 45. The other was a lad of 15, called Turner, and they were at the time herding cattle in the park. The scene seems to have lasted nearly a quarter of an hour, during which time they were quite in possession of themselves, and able to make remarks to each other on what they saw. They were both men of excellent character and an impeccable veracity, and so much that nobody who knew them doubted that they actually saw what they described, or at all events believed that they did. It is so to be observed also that the ground is not swampy, nor subject to any exhalations. About the year 1750, a visionary army of the same description was seen in the neighbourhood of Inverness by a respectable farmer of Glenery and his son. The number of troops was very great, and they had not the slightest doubt that they were otherwise than substantial forms of flesh and blood. They counted at least 16 pairs of columns, and had abundance of time to observe every particular. The front ranks marched 7 abreast, and were accompanied by a good many women and children, who were carrying tin cans and other implements of cookery. The men were clothed in red, and their arms shone brightly in the sun. In the midst of them was an animal, a deer or a horse, they could not distinguish which, that they were driving furiously forward with their bayonets. The younger of the 2 men observed to the other that every now and then the rear ranks were obliged to run to overtake the van, and the elder one, who had been a soldier, remarked that was always the case, and recommended him, if he ever served, to try and march in the front. There was only one mounted officer. He rode a grey dragoon horse, and wore a gold-laced hat and blue hussar cloak, with wide, open sleeves lined with red. The 2 spectators observed him so particularly that they said afterward they should recognize him anywhere. They were, however, afraid of being ill-treated or forced to go along with the troops, whom they concluded had come from Ireland, and landed at Kintyre, and while they were climbing over a dike to get out of the way, the whole thing vanished. Some years since, a phenomenon of the same sort was observed at Paderborn in Westphalia, and seen by at least 30 persons, as well as by horses and dogs, as was discovered by the demeanour of these animals. In October 1836, on the very same spot, there was a review of 20,000 men, and the people then concluded that the former vision was a second sight. A similar circumstance occurred in Stockton Forest some years ago, and there are many recorded elsewhere, one specially in the year 1686 near Lanark, where for several afternoons in the months of June and July there were seen by numerous spectators companies of men in arms marching in order by the banks of the Clyde, and other companies meeting them, added to which they were showers of bonnets, hats, guns, swords, etc., which the seers described with the greatest exactness. All who were present could not see these things, and Walker relates that one gentleman particularly was turning the thing into ridicule, calling the seers damned witches and warlocks with a second sight, boasting that the devil a thing he could see, when he suddenly exclaimed, with fear and trembling, that he now saw it all, and entreated those who did not see to say nothing, a change that may be easily accounted for, be the phenomenon of what nature it may, by supposing him to have touched one of the seers, when the faculty would be communicated like a shock of electricity. With regard to the palingasia, it would be necessary to establish that these objects had previously existed, and that, as Oettinger says, the earthly husk having fallen off, the volatile essence had ascended perfect in form, but void of substance. The notion supported by Baron Reichenbach, that the lights seen in churchyards and over graves are the result of a process going on below, is by no means new, for Gafarilus suggested the same opinion in 1650. Only he speaks of the appearances over graves and in churchyards as shadows, ombres, as they appeared to Billing, and he mentions casually a thing frequently observed, that the same visionary forms are remarked on the ground where battles have been fought, which he thinks arise out of a process between the earth and the sun. When a limb has been cut off, some somnambules still discern the form of the member as if actually attached. But this magical process is said to be not only the work of the elements, but also possible to man, as the forms of plants can be preserved after substance is destroyed, so can that of man be either preserved or reproduced from the elements of his body. In the reign of Louis XIV, 3 alchemists, having distilled some earth taken from the cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, were forced to desist, by seeing the forms of men appearing in their vials, instead of the philosopher's stone which they were seeking. And the physician, who after dissecting a body and pulverizing the cranium, which was then an article admitted into the materia medica, had left the powder on the table of his laboratory in charge of his assistant. The latter, who slept in an adjoining room, was awakened in the night by hearing a noise, which after some search he ultimately traced to the powder, in the midst of which he beheld, gradually constructed itself, a human form. First appeared the head, with 2 open eyes, then the arms and hands, and by degrees the rest of the person, which subsequently assumed the clothes it had worn when alive. The man was of course frightened out of his wits, the rather as the apparition planted itself before the door, and would not let him go away till it had made its own exit, which it speedily did. Similar results have been said to arise from experiments performed on blood. I confess I should be disposed to consider these apparitions, if ever they appeared, cases of genuine ghosts brought into rapport by the operation, rather than forms residing in the bones or blood. At all events, these things are very hard to believe, but seeing we were not there, I do not think we have any right to say they did not happen, or at least that some phenomena did not occur, that they were open to this interpretation. It is highly probable that the seeing of those visionary armies and similar prodigies is a sort of second sight, but having admitted this, we are very little nearer an explanation. Granting that, as in the above experiments, the essence of things may retain the forms of the substance, this does not explain the seeing that which has not yet taken place, or which is taking place at so great a distance that neither Oettinger's essence nor the superficial films of Lucretius can remove the difficulty. It is the fashion to say that second sight was a mere superstition of the Highlanders, and that no such thing is ever heard of now, but those who talk in this way know very little of the matter. No doubt, if they set out to look for seers, they may not find them. Such phenomena, though known in all countries and in all ages, are comparatively rare, as well as uncertain and capricious, and not to be exercised at will. But I know of too many instances of the existence of this faculty in families, as well as of isolated cases occurring to individuals above all suspicion, to entertain the smallest doubt of its reality. But the difficulty of furnishing evidence is considerable. because when the seers are of the humble classes, they are called impostors and not believed, and when they are of the higher, they do not make the subject a matter of conversation, nor choose to expose themselves to the ridicule of the foolish, and consequently the thing is not known beyond their own immediate friends. When the young Duke of Orleans was killed, a lady residing here saw the accident and described it to her husband at the time it was occurring in France. She had frequently seen the Duke when on the continent. Captain N went to stay 2 days at the house of Lady T. After dinner, however, he announced that he was under the necessity of going away that night, nor could he be induced to remain. On being much pressed for an explanation, he confided to some of the party that, during the dinner, he had seen a female figure with her throat cut, standing behind Lady T's chair. Of course, it was thought an illusion, but Lady T was not told of it, lest she should be alarmed. That night, the household was called up for the purpose of summoning a surgeon. Lady T had cut her own throat. Mr. C, who though a Scotchman was an entire skeptic with regard to the second sight, was told by a seer whom he had been jeering on the subject, that within a month he, Mr. C, would be a pall-bearer at a funeral, that he would go by a certain road, but that, before they had crossed the brook, a man in a drab coat would come down the hill and take the pall from him. The funeral occurred, Mr. C was a bearer, and they went by the road described, but he firmly resolved that he would disappoint the seer by keeping the pall while they crossed the brook. But shortly before they reached it, the postman overtook them with letters, which in that part of the country arrived but twice a week, and Mr. C, who was engaged in some speculations of importance, turned to receive them, at which moment the pall was taken from him, and on looking round, he saw it was by a man in a drab coat. A medical friend of mine, who practised some time at Deptford, was once sent for to a girl who had been taken suddenly ill. He found her with inflammation of the brain, and the only account the mother could give of it was that, shortly before, she had run into the room, crying, "Oh, mother, I have seen Uncle John drowned in his boat under the 5th arch of Rochester Bridge." The girl died a few hours afterward, and on the following night the uncle's boat ran foul of the bridge, and he was drowned, exactly as she had foretold. Mrs. A, an English lady, and the wife of a clergyman, relates that, previous to her marriage, she, with her father and mother being at the seaside, had arranged to make a few days' excursion to some races that were about to take place, and that the night before they started, the father having been left alone while the ladies were engaged with their preparations, they found him, on descending to the drawing-room, in a state of considerable agitation, which, he said, had arisen from his having seen a dreadful face at one corner of the room. He described it as a bruised, battered, crushed, discoloured face, with the 2 eyes protruding frightfully from their sockets. But the features were too disfigured to ascertain if it were the face of anyone he knew. On the following day, on their way to the races, an accident occurred, and he was brought home with his own face exactly in the condition he had described. He had never exhibited any other instance of this extraordinary faculty, and the impression made by the circumstance lasted the remainder of his life, which was unhappily shortened by the injuries he had received. The late Mrs. V, a lady of fortune and family, who resides near Loch Lomond, possessed this faculty in an extraordinary degree, and displayed it on many remarkable occasions. When her brother was shipwrecked in the Channel, she was heard to exclaim, "Thank God he's saved," and describe the scene with all its circumstances. Colonel David Stewart, a determined believer in what he calls the supernatural, in his book on the Highlanders, relates the following fact as one so remarkable that credulous minds may be excused for believing it to have been prophetic. He says that, late in an autumnal evening of the year 1773, the son of a neighbour came to his father's house, and soon after his arrival inquired for a little boy of the family, then about 3 years old. He was shown up to the nursery, and found the nurse putting a pair of new shoes on the child, which she complained did not fit. "Never mind," said the young man, "they'll fit him before he wants them," a prediction which not only offended the nurse, but seemed at the moment absurd, since the child was apparently in perfect health. When he joined the party in the drawing-room, he being much jeered upon his new gift of second sight, explained that the impression he had received originated in his having just seen a funeral passing the wooden bridge which crossed the stream at a short distance from the house. He first observed a crowd of people, and on coming near he saw a person carrying a small coffin, followed by about 20 gentlemen, all of his acquaintance, his own father and a Mr. Stewart being among the number. He did not attempt to join the procession, which he saw turn off into the churchyard, but knowing his own father could not be actually there, and that Mr. and Mrs. Stewart were then at Blair, he felt a conviction that the phenomenon portended the death of the child, a persuasion which was verified by its suddenly expiring on the following night. And Colonel Stewart adds that the circumstances and attendance at the funeral were precisely such as the young man had described. He mentions also that this gentleman was not a seer, that he was a man of education and general knowledge, and that this was the first and only vision of the sort he had ever had. I know of a young lady who has 3 times seen funerals in this way. The old persuasion that fasting was a means of developing the spirit of prophecy is undoubtedly well-founded, and the annals of medicine furnish numerous facts which establish it. A man condemned to death at Viterbo, having abstained from food in the hope of escaping execution, became so clairvoyant that he could tell what was doing in any part of the prison. The expression used in the report is that he saw through the walls. This, however, could not be with his natural organs of sight. It is worthy of observation that idiots often possess some glimpse of this faculty of second sight or presentiment, and it's probably on this account that they are in some countries held sacred. Presentiment, which I think may very probably be merely the vague and imperfect recollection of what we knew in our sleep, is often observed in drunken people. In the Great Plague at Basel, which occurred toward the end of the 16th century, almost everybody who died called out in their last moments the name of the person that was to follow them next. Not long ago, a servant girl on the state of D of S saw with amazement 5 figures ascending a perpendicular cliff, quite inaccessible to human feet. One was a boy wearing a cap with red binding. She watched them with great curiosity till they reached the top, where they all stretched themselves on the earth, with countenances expressive of great dejection. While she was looking at them they disappeared, and she immediately related her vision. Shortly afterward, a foreign ship in distress was seen to put off a boat with 4 men and a boy. The boat was dashed to pieces in the surf, and the 5 bodies, exactly answering the description she had given, were thrown on shore at the foot of the cliff, which they had perhaps climbed in the spirit. How well what we call clairvoyance was known, though how little understood, at the period of the witch persecution, is proved by what Dr. Henry Moore says in his Antidote against Atheism. We will now pass to those supernatural effects which are observed in them that are bewitched or possessed, and such as of foretelling things to come, telling what such and such persons speak or do, as exactly as if they were by them, when the party possessed is at one end of the town, and sitting in a house within doors, and those parties that act and comfort together are without at the other end of the town. To be able to see some and not others, to play at cards with one certain person, and not to discern anybody else at the table beside him, to act and talk, and go up and down, and tell what will become of things, and what happens in those fits of possession, and then, as soon as the possessed or bewitched party is out of them, to remember nothing at all, but to inquire concerning the welfare of those whose faces they seemed to look upon just before, when they were in their fits, a state which he believes to arise from the devils having taken possession of the body of the magnetic person, which is precisely the theory supported by many fanatical persons in our own day. Dr. Moore was not a fanatic, but this phenomena, though very well understood by the ancient philosophers, as well as by Paracelsus, Van Helmont, Cornelius Agrippa, Jacob Behmen, a Scotch physician called Maxwell, who published on the subject in the 17th century, and many others, were still, when observed, looked upon as the effects of diabolical influence by mankind in general. When Monsieur Sixdeniers, the artist, was drowned in the Seine in 1846, after his body had been vainly sought, a somnambule was applied to, in whose hands they placed a portfolio belonging to him, and being asked where the owner was, she evinced great terror, held up her dress as if walking in the water, and said that he was between 2 boats, under the Pont des Arts, with nothing on but a flannel waistcoat, and there he was found. A friend of mine knows a lady who early one morning, being in a natural state of clairvoyance without magnetism, saw the porter of the house where her son lodged ascend to his room with a carving knife, go to his bed where he lay asleep, lean over him, then open a chest, take out a 50-pound note, and retire. On the following day, she went to her son and asked him if he had any money in the house. He said, "Yes, I have 50 pounds," whereupon she bade him seek it, but it was gone. They stopped payment of the note, but did not prosecute, thinking the evidence insufficient. Subsequently, the porter being taken up for other crimes, the note was found crumpled up at the bottom of an old purse belonging to him. Dr. Anna Moser says that there is no doubt of the ancient Sibyls having been clairvoyant women, and that it is impossible so much value could have been attached to their books, had not their revelations been verified. A maid-servant, residing in a family in Northumberland, one day last winter was heard to utter a violent scream immediately after she had left the kitchen. On following her to inquire what had happened, she said that she had just seen her father in his night clothes, with a most horrible countenance, and she was sure something dreadful had happened to him. 2 days afterward there arrived a letter, saying he had been seized with delirium tremens, and was at the point of death, which accordingly ensued. There are innumerable cases of this sort recorded in various collections, not to mention the much more numerous ones that meet with no recorder, and I could myself mention many more, but this will suffice. One, however, I will not omit, for, though historical, it's not generally known. A year before the rebellion broke out, in consequence of which Lord Kilmarnock lost his head, the family were one day startled by a scream, and on rushing out to inquire what had occurred, they found the servants all assembled in amazement, with the exception of one maid, who they said had gone up to the garrets to hang some linen on the lines to dry. On ascending thither, they found the girl on the floor, in a state of insensibility, and they had no sooner revived her than, on seeing Lord Kilmarnock bending over her, she screamed and fainted again. When ultimately recovered, she told them that while hanging up her linen and singing, the door had burst open and his lordship's bloody head had rolled in. I think it came twice. This event was so well known at the time, that on the first rumours of the rebellion, Lord Saltoun said, "Kilmarnock will lose his head." It was answered, that Kilmarnock had not joined the rebels. "He will, and will be beheaded," returned Lord Saltoun. Now, in these cases, we are almost compelled to believe that the phenomenon is purely subjective, and there is no veritable outstanding object seen. Yet, when we have taken refuge in this hypothesis, the difficulty remains as great as ever, and is to me much more incomprehensible than ghost-seeing, because in the latter we suppose an external agency acting in some way or other on the seer. I have already mentioned that Oberlin, the good pastor of Bain de la Roche, himself a ghost-seer, asserted that everything earthly had its counterpart, or antitype, in the other world, not only organized but unorganized matter. If so, do we sometimes see these antitypes? Dr. Anna Moser, in treating of second sight, which by the way is quite as well known in Germany, and especially in Denmark as in the Highlands of Scotland, says that as in natural somnambulism there is a partial internal vigilance, so does the seer fall, while awake, into a dream state. He suddenly becomes motionless and stiff. His eyes are open, and his senses are, while the vision lasts, unperceptive of all external objects. The vision may be communicated by the touch, and sometimes persons at a distance from each other, but connected by blood or sympathy, have the vision simultaneously. He remarks also that, as we have seen in the above case of Mr. C, any attempt to frustrate the fulfillment of the vision never succeeds, inasmuch as the attempt appears to be taken into the account. The seeing in glass and in crystals is equally inexplicable, as is the magical seeing of the Egyptians. Every now and then we hear it said that this last is discovered to be an imposition, because some traveller has either actually fallen into the hands of an impostor, and there are impostors in all trades, or because the phenomenon was imperfectly exhibited, a circumstance which, as the exhibitions of clairvoyants and somnambulists, where all the conditions are not under command, or even recognized, must necessarily happen. But not to mention the accounts published by Mr. Lane and Lord Prudhoe, whoever has read that of Monsieur Léon Laborde must be satisfied that the thing is an indisputable fact. It is in fact only another form of the seeing in crystals which has been known in all ages, and of which many modern instances have occurred among somnambulic patients. We see by the 44th chapter of Genesis that it was by his cup that Joseph prophesied. Is not this it in which my Lord drinketh, and whereby indeed he divineth? But, as Dr. Passavant observes, and as we shall presently see, in the anecdote of the boy and the gypsy, the virtue does not lie in the glass nor in the water, but in the seer himself, who may possess a more or less developed faculty. The external objects and ceremonies being only the means of concentrating the attention and intensifying the power. Monsieur Léon Laborde witnessed the exhibition at Cairo before Lord P.'s visit. The exhibitor, named Ahmed, appeared to him a respectable man, who spoke simply of his science, and had nothing of the charlatan about him. The first child employed was a boy 11 years old, the son of a European, and Ahmed, having traced some figures on the palm of his hand, and poured ink over them, bade him look for the reflection of his own face. The child said he saw it. The magician then burnt some powders in a brazier, and bade him tell him when he saw a soldier sweeping a place, and while the fumes from the brazier diffused themselves, he pronounced a sort of litany. Presently the child threw back his head, and screaming with terror, sobbed out, while bathed in tears, that he had seen a dreadful face. Fearing the boy might be injured, Monsieur Laborde now called up a little Arab servant, who had never seen or heard of the magician. He was gay and laughing, and not at all frightened, and the ceremony being repeated, he said he saw the soldier sweeping in the front of a tent. He was then desired to bid the soldier bring Shakespeare, Colonel Cradock, and several other persons, and he described every person and thing so exactly as to be entirely satisfactory. During the operations the boy looked as if intoxicated, with his eyes fixed and the perspiration dripping from his brow. Ahmed disenchanted him by placing his thumbs on his eyes. He gradually recovered, and gaily related all he had seen, which he perfectly remembered. Now, this is merely another form of what the Laplanders, the African magicians, and the shamans of Siberia do by taking narcotics and turning round till they fall down in a state of insensibility, in which condition they are clear seers, and besides vaticinating, describe scenes, places, and persons they have never seen. In Barbary they anoint their hands with a black ointment, and then holding them up in the sun, they see whatever they desire, like the Egyptians. Lady S. possesses somewhat of a singular faculty naturally. By walking rapidly round a room several times, till a certain degree of vertigo is produced, she will name to you any person you have privately thought of or agreed upon with others. Her phrase is, I see, so and so. Monsieur Laborde purchased the secret of Ahmed, who said he had learned it from two celebrated sheiks of his own country, which was Algiers. Monsieur L. found it connected with both physics and magnetism, and practised it himself afterward with perfect success. And he affirms positively that under the influence of a particular organization and certain ceremonies, among which he cannot distinguish which are indispensable and which are not, that a child, without fraud or collusion, can see, as through a window or peephole, people moving, who appear and disappear at their command, and with whom they hold communication, and they remember everything after the operation. He says, I narrate, but explain nothing. I produce those effects, but cannot comprehend them. I only affirm in the most positive manner that what I relate is true. I perform the experiment in various places, with various subjects, before numerous witnesses, in my own room or other rooms, in the open air, and even in a boat on the Nile. The exactitude and detailed descriptions of persons, places, and scenes could by no possibility be feigned. Moreover, Baron Dupotet has very lately succeeded in obtaining this phenomena in Paris, from persons not somnambulic selected from his audience. The chief difference being that they did not recollect what they had seen when the crisis was over. Cagliostro, though a charlatan, was possessed of his secret, and it was his great success in it that chiefly sustained his reputation. The spectators, convinced he could make children see distant places and persons in glass, were persuaded he could do other things, which appeared to them no more mysterious. Dr. D. was perfectly honest with regard to his mirror, in which he could see by concentrating his mind on it, but as he could not remember what he saw, he employed Kelly to see for him, while he himself wrote down the revelations, and Kelly was a rogue, and deceived and ruined him. A friend of Pfeffel's knew a boy, apprenticed to an apothecary at Shop and Wire, who, having been observed to amuse himself by looking into vials filled with water, was asked what he saw, when it was discovered that he possessed this faculty of seeing in glass, which was afterward very frequently exhibited for the satisfaction of the curious. Pfeffel also mentions another boy who had this faculty, and who went about the country with a small mirror, answering questions, recovering stolen goods, etc. He said that he one day fell in with some gypsies, one of whom was sitting apart and staring into his glass. The boy, from curiosity, looked over his shoulder and exclaimed that he saw a fine man who was moving about, whereupon the gypsy, having interrogated him, gave him the glass. "For," said he, "I have been staring it long enough, and can see nothing but my own face." It is almost unnecessary to observe that the sacred books of the Jews and of the Indians testify to their acquaintance with this mode of divination, as well as many others. Many persons will have heard or read an account of Mr. Canning and Mr. Huskinson having seen, while in Paris, the visionary representation of their own deaths in water, as exhibited to them by a Russian or Polish lady there. As I do not, however, know what authority there is for this story, I will not insist on it here. But Saint Simon relates a very curious circumstance of this nature, which occurred at Paris, and was related to him by the Duke of Orleans, afterward regent. The latter said that he had sent on the preceding evening for a man, then in Paris, who pretended to exhibit whatever was desired in a glass of water. He came, and a child of 7 years old, belonging to the house, being called up, they bade her tell what she saw doing in certain places. She did, and as they sent to these places and found her report correct, they bade her next describe under what circumstances the king would die, without, however, asking when the death would take place. The child knew none of the court, and had never been at Versailles. Yet she described everything exactly, the room, bed, furniture, and the king himself, Madame de Maintenon, Fagon the physician, the princes and princesses, everybody, in short, including a child, wearing an order in the arms of a lady whom she recognized at having seen. This was Madame de Ventadour. It was remarkable that she omitted the Dukes de Bourgogne and Berry, and Monsieur Neur, and also the Duchess de Bourgogne. Orleans insisted they must be there, describing them, but she always said no. These persons were then all well, but they died before the king. She also saw the children of the Prince and Princess of Conti, but not themselves, which was correct, as they also died shortly after this occurrence. Orleans then wished to see his own destiny, and the man said, if he would not be frightened he could show it to him, as if painted on the wall, and after 15 minutes of conjuration the Duke appeared, of the natural size, dressed as usual, but with a couronne fermée, or closed crown on his head, which they could not comprehend, as it was not that of any country they knew of. It covered his head, and only 4 circles, and nothing at the top. They had never seen such one. When he became regent, they understood that that was the interpretation of the prediction. In connection with this subject, the aversion to glass frequently manifested by dogs is well worthy of observation. When facts of this kind are found to be recorded or believed in all parts of the world, from the beginning of it up to the present time, it is surely vain for the so-called savants to deny them, and, as Cicero justly says in describing the different kinds of magic, what we have to do with is the facts, since of the cause we know little. Neither, he adds, are we to repudiate these phenomena, because we sometimes find them imperfect, or even false, any more than we are to distrust that the human eye sees, although some do this very imperfectly, or not at all. We are a part spirit and part matter. By the former we are allied to the spiritual world and to the absolute spirit. And as nobody doubts that the latter can work magically, that is, for by the mere act of will all things were created, and by its constant exertion all things are sustained, why should we be astonished that we, who partake of the divine nature and were created after God's own image, should also, within certain limits, partake of this magical power? That this power has been frequently abused is the fault of those who, being capable, refuse to investigate, and deny the existence of this and similar phenomena, and by thus casting them out of the region of legitimate science, leave them to become the prey of the ignorant and designing. Dr. Ennemoser, in his very learned work on magic, shows us that all the phenomena of magnetism and somnambulism, and all the various kinds of divination, have been known and practiced in every country under the sun, and have been intimately connected with, and indeed may be traced up to the fountainhead of every religion. What are the limits of these powers possessed by us while in the flesh? How far they may be developed, and whether, at the extreme verge of what we can effect, we begin to be aided by God or by spirits of other spheres of existence bordering on ours? We know not, but with respect to the morality of these practices, it suffices that what is good in act or intention must come of good, and what is evil in act or intention must come of evil, which is true now, as it was in the time of Moses and the prophets, when miracles and magic were used for purposes holy and unholy, and were to be judged accordingly. God works by natural laws, of which we yet know very little, and in some departments of his kingdom nothing. And whatever appears to us supernatural only appears so from our ignorance. And whatever faculties or powers he has endowed us with, it must have been designed we should exercise and cultivate for the benefit and advancement of our race. Nor can I for one moment suppose that, though like everything else liable to abuse, the legitimate exercise of these powers, if we knew their range, would be useless, much less pernicious or sinful. Of the magical power of will, as I have said before, we know nothing, and it does not belong to a purely rationalistic age to acknowledge what it cannot understand. In all countries men have arisen, here and there, who have known it, and some traces of it have survived both in language and in popular superstitions. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible to you. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out by prayer and fasting. And voyez et croyez, will and believe, was the solution Puységur gave of his magical cures, and no doubt the explanation of those affected by royal hands is to be found in the fact that they believed in themselves, and having faith they could exercise will. But with the belief in the divine right of kings, the faith and the power would naturally expire together. With respect to what Christ says, in the above-quoted passage, of fasting, numerous instances are extant, proving that clear seeing and other magical or spiritual powers are sometimes developed by it. William Crowe, a doctor of philosophy and a lecturer at Jena, who died during the prevalence of the cholera, cultivated these powers and preached them. I have not been able to obtain his works, they being suppressed as far as is practicable by the Prussian government. Crowe could leave his body, and to all appearance die whenever he pleased. One of his disciples, yet living, Count von Aberstein, possesses the same faculty. Many writers of the 16th century were well acquainted with the power of will, and to this was attributed the good or evil influence of blessings and curses. They believed it to be of great effect in curing diseases, and that by it alone life might be extinguished. That, subjectively, life may be extinguished, we have seen by the cases of Colonel Townshend, the dervish that was buried, Hermotinus, and others. For doubtless the power that could perform so much could, under an adequate motive, have performed more. And since all things in nature, spiritual and material, are connected, and that there is an unceasing interaction between them, we being members of one great whole, only individualized by our organisms, it is possible to conceive that the power which can be exerted on our own organism might be extended to others. And since we cannot conceive man to be an isolated being, the only intelligence besides God, none above us and none below, but must, on the contrary, believe that there are numerous grades of intelligences, it seems to follow, of course, that we must stand in some kind of relation to them, more or less intimate. Nor is it at all surprising that with some individuals this relation should be more intimate than with others. Finally, we are not entitled to deny the existence of this magical or spiritual power as exerted by either incorporated or unincorporated spirits, because we do not comprehend how it can be exerted, since, in spite of all the words that have been expended on the subject, we are equally ignorant of the mode in which our own will acts upon our own muscles. We know the fact, but not the mode of it. End of chapter 17. Recording by Liana Leite.